installed Visual Studio and taken a look around in Visual Studio, we're ready to begin creating our very first practicum project in this course. This is a very simple project called Leap Year Checker, and its purpose is simply to present the workflow of creating a Windows GUI application with WinForms using Visual Basic. In this project, Farmer Al Manac needs a program to check if any given year is a leap year or not, 366 days versus 365 days. Your assignment is to develop a simple Windows GUI app program as shown at the right. So here's our program. The user is going to enter a year in this yellow box, click Test It, and then get feedback in terms of, is it a leap year? So in this case, 2026 is not a leap year, but 2028 is. So here's our rule of thumb. A leap year is evenly divisible by 4, but not by 100. That's how we're going to solve this, doing a little math on the year. So is it divisible by 4 evenly? And is it not divisible by 100? Because every 100 years is not a leap year, even though it's divisible by 4. Well, let's take a look at the process. We talked about the software development life cycle, in which there is a need. You just saw the need was to develop a program to check if a year is a leap year or not. We build our interface, and in doing that, we do some planning. And there's a couple things that we can do as far as planning. One of those is we can create an IPO chart. Every program basically comes down to input, process, and output. And we'll look at that in detail in a few more minutes. Then we need to design our interface, and there I use a tool called a storyboard most often. And then we need to design our algorithm to make it do something, to make it work. And there's a couple processes there. That's pseudo code and flowcharting. We'll look at both of those. It might also be done in your head as a mental process for a simple program. We're going to take our need, build our interface, code it, and then we're going to test and debug. Now, a lot of times, your program won't work the first time. And that's to be expected. Every programmer, I don't care if you've been programming for a week or over 35 years like I have been, you're going to have errors in your code sometimes. And so there's a couple things we can do. We can go back and change the code. We can also go back and maybe change the interface. Maybe find the interface just isn't quite proper. Or sometimes, and it's rare, we have to go back and revisit that need. You know, I think I misstated the need. Let's change it, make this work. Once we get it working, then it's time to deploy it to our computer or maybe to the Windows Store or somehow distribute this. Now notice we go back to the need. This is a cycle because down the road, you're probably going to find ways to improve this or add new features. And so this is a cyclical process that continues on with different renditions or different phases. Now I mentioned the assessment IPO. Let's go back and look at what an IPO chart looks like. So pretty much every program comes down to input, process, and output. We're going to define what is the input. What do we need to have to make our program work? And usually we're going to get that from a user, but it could come from a data file. And then what's the output? What do we want to generate from that input? It might be a report, it might be some type of calculation. And then once we find out those two things, we go into the middle here and determine what's the process. How do we get from the input to the output? And that is our program. So input, process, and output. Now that's a very simple approach to programming. We're going to start out very simple. But if you think about developing a high-end game, it still is going to be input, process, and output. You're going to get input from the user in terms of their keystrokes to move a character, and the result that's going to move a character, maybe they get shot, maybe they shoot somebody, but in that process, something's going to happen. So we have input, output, and then process causing those things to work together. If you'll think about programs in that sense, I think you'll find programming much easier. We also have to design the interface. We're going to create graphical user interfaces, or GUI interfaces. And Visual Basic is perfect for this. We have Toolbox where we can drag and drop objects, what we call controls, and it might be a label which contains static text. It could be a text box which contains dynamic text, so the user might enter something in. And it could be a button that the user clicks to do something. And we've got all three of those here. So at the top, this is my storyboard. I simply sketch out what it should look like and identify those controls. And in some cases, they have names, such as the text box there is named TXT year. And I put some properties there in terms of the fonts, maybe the background color. You could do this in color if you wanted, using something like Photoshop. I usually just sketch this out with paper and pencil. And the idea behind this is now I have a blueprint of what should my program look like. And I can actually hand this off to another programmer, and they should be able to create this interface. using the specifications I've given. Next, we need to define the algorithm. How are we going to make that process work? And there are two ways for defining algorithms. One is using a visual flowchart. I'm a visual learner, so I like using flowcharts. There are lots of ways to do this, lots of software out there. I oftentimes just use paper and pencil again. In this case, I actually used Microsoft Word to develop this flowchart. PowerPoint can also do that. But there's some programs out there that are strictly for developing flowcharts. One I like to use is Microsoft Visio. I'll also use Photoshop. So that's one approach. We represent things logically, and you can see the flow here. This is our code for our BTN test it button. We're going to get the year as an integer from the text box named txt year. We're going to do some math calculations. We're using the mod operator here. That gives us a integer remainder, integer division remainder. So if I divide the year by 4 and there's nothing left over, and I divide the year by 100, but there is something left over, then we have a flow going to the right here. This is an output symbol. So we have input and output symbols that are the same in a flowchart. This little diamond represents a decision. And so here our output is, yes, the year is a leap year, and we're going to show that in green. If this is not true, then we're going to come this way. So we have two different paths to follow here. This is called an if-else structure. Now, I don't expect you to understand any of the code or any of the structure. This is just to show you how we would design a program. So if the year is not evenly divisible by 4, or it is evenly divisible by 100, then we're going to say, no, that year is not a leap year. I'm going to show that in red. And then our program ends, or that routine ends. Now, flowcharting is one way to do this. A lot of people like to use pseudocode. This is just writing out the steps in English. So we're going to get the year from the user via the txt year text box and convert it to an integer variable. We're going to name that variable year. And if year mod 4 equals 0 and year mod 100 does not equal 0, then we're going to display the year in green as a leap year. Otherwise, else, we're going to display it as not a leap year, and we're going to show that in red. So two different ways to show the same thing. I prefer flowcharts, but a lot of times I do use pseudocode. Then we can take the flowchart, or we can take the pseudocode in a Visual Studio. This is the job of the programmer, is to convert that into Visual Basic code. Now again, I don't expect you to understand the code, but this is what we're going to enter into our program to make it work. You can see the code's not that long, a few lines. So that's our planning process. In the next video, I'll walk you through actually creating this project in Visual Studio. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.